I bought this fabric, which is actually upholstery, well, I guess it's drapery fabric or upholstery fabric, but it's light enough that I can make some Bermuda shorts from it. And I have some fabric. I've already made a blouse from that fabric, so I want to make a shell like this one I'm wearing out of this fabric to go with the Bermuda shorts I'm going to make from this fabric. And I've got the pieces cut to make the blouse just like the one I'm wearing. Now it happens that if I remove the sleeves from the pattern, I don't need to have any zipper in the back or side seam, which I thought I did in the beginning. So this is a very fast top to make. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to test the machine to make sure the tension and the stitch length are correct for the fabric that I'm going to be using. I have a size 70 needle in here, and I'm leaving this container out on my machine so I know what size needle I have in the machine, because it's kind of hard to read it off the needle itself. And as you know, when you put the needle in, you put the flat side in the back, and the front is where the scarf is, and that's where the thread is in the needle when it goes down into the race to sew. All right, now I'm going to turn it on. Expect some racket because you're going to hear it. Here we go. I have it on the longest stitch on the sewing machine, which is a 4 on this particular machine, and it's too long a stitch. That's a basting stitch. So I'm going to make this stitch smaller. I'm going to bring it just to a little more than a 2, and I'm going to see what happens when I sew it with that length. Let's see how it is now. And by the way, you notice there's a bit of a zigzag here with the 4. I really don't want that. I want the stitch to be as straight as possible. Now, when you are working with a machine that has a zigzag, usually the straight stitch has just a little bit of a zigzag. You don't get it perfectly straight. Now let's see what I've got. It looks better. Still a bit of a zigzag. I'm going to make the stitch just a little smaller and see how it is then. I like that stitch better. I want to make sure. So you want it to be the same on the bottom as the top. It looks like it's pulling down into the bottom. I'm going to make the tension a little bit tighter and see what happens then. It's more to my liking. You want to do this, by the way, before you sew any garment together, because when you move from one fabric to another, your machine may sew a little bit differently, and you want to make sure you're getting the best possible stitch for your garment. I've seen people in the industry, they just write on and on. I can't tell you how many samples they make until they're finally happy with the machine setting. That's the best yet. Okay, that's it. It's just a little past the 4. I finally got the stitch I want. All right, so now I'm just going to leave the fabric under the machine like this, because this is called chaining through. And I've got all these strips. They're 1 1/4 inch wide. That's the width of your L square. And that's the width I need to put the binding around the neck. So this would just be 1 ply of fabric with this finish around the edge. It's going to be machine sewn on this side, and then I'm going to hand finish it on this side. This is cut on the bias, by the way, so this is a straight grain here. And you can see the selvage here, so you know it's a straight grain. I am doing what's called tacking. It's not going backward, it's just going up and down in place. And that will lock your stitches. I measured the pattern around the neck and around the armhole. So I didn't cut more of this than I need. There's no point in wasting your time cutting things you don't need. And it's off for a minute so we don't have to listen to it. And just clip this one after another. There. And I'm just going to leave it in the machine, because the next thing I'm going to do is start sewing my top together. And I see that this has got a 1/2 inch seam allowance on the side. It doesn't matter here. I know this is a 3/8 inch seam allowance, but I'm going to be putting the binding around that, so it's not, a sleeve's not going to be sewn in that. And this, of course, the binding's going to go around it. But up here, it doesn't happen to have it marked, but it is 1/2 inch. I want to show you how I mark darts. First of all, I do not use a tracing wheel and tracing paper. That, to me, just makes a mess. So this is what I do. I push the pins through the darting. And I already did this, but I'm showing you what I did. And I did it on the tape. I didn't do it on this sewing machine. And then I turn it over. I have taken a ruler and a yellow pencil, and then I connect those dots so I know where to sew it. And this is very light pencil. Whatever you're going to use to mark your fabric, be sure you check it on a scrap piece of fabric first to make sure that you can get it out or that it won't show on the right side. In this case, it won't show on the right side. So even though the mark is probably permanent, it really doesn't matter. All right, the next thing I'm going to do is take out these pins. And I'm going to put the pattern aside, but I'm keeping it at the sewing machine so that I need to check anything, I have the pattern to look at. This is a pretty simple top to make. Even so, I want my pattern right there next to me so that if I have any concerns, and I probably won't have any, but if I do, I don't have to get up and go find the pattern. All right, now that I have this all marked, the next thing I do is I pin the dart. All right, so first of all, I pin the point like this. Now, when I sew, I'm going to sew down to come off this point, and I'm going to sew up to come off that point. So I want the pins in the direction that I'm going to be sewing. So in this side, I'm going to be sewing up, so I'm going to put my pins so they point toward the center, and I'm making sure that I put the pin through both lines, one on either side of the fold. In the factories, they don't pin. So how do they do this? And the answer is, in lower end garments, these connection points on the darts are drilled through, and there's actually a burn through where they drill through. So you can't change those darts, you can't move them. In higher end garments, they use markers and they chalk it out. All right, now I've got it pinned, and so the next thing is, remember I didn't take my previous work out of the machine. I stopped. You see the thread is still in the machine. This, by the way, saves a lot of thread if you do this. All right, so the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to put the needle down. First the needle goes down, then the presser foot goes down, making sure it's not on the pin that's above it because that'll cause problems. And I'm going to turn the machine on again. We have to loosen all this bracket. And I'm sewing right down the line, and I know that I'm going through the line on the other side because I pinned it that way. At least I hope I am. I'm going to check when I'm finished sewing this dart to make sure that happened. And here I'm sewing slower. See, this machine does sew very fast, as you just seen a few minutes ago, but it also sews very slow, which is a real asset. I'm even going to put my hand on the wheel to make sure it stops when I want it to. Now, in the industry, they often tack this tight, so you just go up and down there, and that would be it. But I'm going to do the more higher end method. Now I'm looking on this side, and I see that I pretty much sewn right in the yellow line. It's a little bit off here, but it's not enough to matter, so I'm not going to change that. And we'll put the needle right in here. First the needle down, then the foot, and now I'm going to come off the top. I'm going right up to the point. I'm going to come right off and keeping an eye on where that needle came out, the pin came out. And there again, I'm going to leave long threads, like that. All right, now here, I'm going to clip this. You can see why snips are really great. On the net, if you're looking to buy them, you have to look for thread clippers, but in the industry you call them snips. All right, I have more darts in the front. You want to sew your darts in first before you sew the seams, because you just have a small piece. when you are sewing a garment, you need to do everything you can to each piece that needs to be sewn before you sew it to another piece, because it's easier. You just have that one piece and you're sewing on that one piece. So you wouldn't sew the seams and then sew the darts. It don't make any sense. Also, with zippers, you always want to put the zippers in as soon as possible when you're making a garment. Now, this garment doesn't require any zippers, so I'm off the hook with that one. But those garments that do need zippers, that's the first thing I do. I put the zippers in as soon as possible. You can't always put it in first, but you want to put it in as soon as possible. Bring that off. And I want to clip it here. Turn the machine off for a little bit. When you want to pull thread out of the machine, make this lever go as high as possible, and of course the presser foot is up, and even if you press it against the lever and make it go even higher, it will come right out with no problem. And you want to pull the thread to the back of the machine. Okay, so here we are, and I have these threads, and I'm going to tie them like this. Oops. Butterfingers. Like that. I want to make sure that this dart is going to stay finished. I'm not particularly keen on mending clothes, even if they might be 15 or 16 years old, because if I've sewn it right, I'm not going to have to mend them. And I'm very interested in not doing any work I don't have to do. So now I'm going to look at my little sewing box, and here's my box of needles. As you can see, my needles and my pins are in little boxes. I'm not using pin cushions because put them in, take them out, put them in, take it out. That's too much work. I'm not interested in doing that. Alright, so now I'm going to take a small needle. I'm going to close this so none of them fall out, of the only one's out. And I'm going to put the needle in the dart like this, making sure it's not showing on the other side. And then I'm going to take the two threads and snip them so they're even. I wet it a little bit because it's cotton covered polyester, and cotton when wet is stronger, and that means it's going to be easier to thread it through the needle, and through the needle it's going to go. Now I don't have any problem seeing the eye of needles, but I know some people do, and there are thread little things that you can use to help you thread through a needle, but I don't need them, so I don't have any of that. Also, you could tack at the bottom instead of sewing the threads in. Now come on, here won't go for me. Come on. Alright, push it on that end. There we go. And I pull it up, and voila. And now the next thing I'm going to do is clip it. There. And that dart's point is finished. I'm not going to sit here in this film and finish all these while you watch, because it's ridiculous. Okay, I've sewn all the darts in, and if you look closely at this pattern, you'll see that it only has one dart on either side here. However, when I worked with the pattern to get it to fit, I found that I needed a second dart to just take up some ease over here on the side. So my garments have two darts on either side rather than one like the pattern. Doesn't matter, fits me, so who cares? Alright, now all the darts are in. As you can see, the threads still need to be tied and sewn back into the dart, but I'm going to do that while I'm watching TV. Now, it's important to know that when you sew shoulders, you want to sew from the neck out. Alright, that's what you want to do. Now the first thing I want to make sure is that I don't sew the right side to the wrong side or some dumb thing like that. So here's the front, and here's the back, and here's the darts, and here's the darts, so I know I'm sewing correctly. The first thing I'm going to do is put this scrap fabric underneath the machine and sew out, because I don't want those little wads of thread that sometimes start when you start this machine, when you start sewing a seam. Who needs that? So if there's going to be a wad of little thread, it's going to be in this scrap fabric. And it just so happens every time you sew a little scrap fabric first, you don't get a wad of thread. You only get a wad of thread when you start sewing the actual garment. So do this, and you don't have to be bothered with wads of threads at all. This is the way it goes. All right, now, I want to put flat felt seams in this garment, okay? And flat felt seams are what, with men's shirts, are called single needle. So when you go in to buy a man's shirt, you'll see that it will either say single needle or double needle. Sometimes it doesn't say either. But when they sew the seams in men's shirts, they're flat felt seams. And there is a machine in the industry which will sew 2 rows at once. So they only have to go down the seam once. But that's double needle. But if they sew it the more expensive way, it's single needle. And what I'm showing you is single needle because this machine has a single needle. And this is actually 1/2 inch seam allowance, so I'm going to sew it back just a fraction. And actually this would be a 3/8 inch seam allowance, so it's going to make this garment, the neck, just a little bit lower, like about 1/8 of an inch lower, but I don't care. I'm going to sew this on 1/2 and 1/4, which comes out to 3/8 inch seam allowance. So what's happening is the front of the garment is going to be 1/8 of an inch higher than would otherwise be. But that's not going to make much difference. So here we go. And the reason I want to sew it with the front extending is because I want the seam that's going to show, because there's going to be a second seam, I want it to be on the back, not on the front. Normally you would sew from the neck out on both sides of the garment, but because I'm doing a flat felt seam, I'm going to do the opposite. And this is not kosher, by the way, but I don't want that seam to show on the front. I want it to be on the back of my shoulder, in back of the shoulder seam, not in front of the shoulder seam. And I want it to be the same on both sides, so that's why I'm doing this. Like I said, this is not the thing you're supposed to do, but I'm doing it anyway. So I don't always play according to the rules, but I have justification for what I'm doing. I am sewing against the direction of the grain, and that's why I'm shearing it. And I'm putting my finger behind so that I'm not allowing the fabric to stretch as I sew it. As you can see, the front extends beyond the back seam. I'm turning the top ply underneath like this. As a matter of fact, I'm going to put a pin in to make it help it stay in place. What I don't like is I'm getting this zigzag on the underside. So I'm going to sew it on this side and hope for the best. And I'm feeling the edge with my finger. I'm putting the needle down. Pulled the pin out because I can feel it, and I can feel the edge with my finger. Need to have this good and flat. I'm going to check to see what it's doing underneath. And I see that it's undoing itself, so I've folded it up again. Alright, and what I've got now is a flat felt seam. Now it's wrinkled on me, but I think that's going to press out. I'm not sure. I'm not too happy with that. And it didn't catch there at the end either, so I'm going to sew back over it and take the original stitching out. I'm not happy with that at all. It's a mess. Now let's see what we've got. That caught. Alright. I found that if I put this lever over to the right and back again real hard, jerked it back, that I then got a straight stitch underneath. So I'm much happier with the stitching that shows underneath. So now I'm going to finish the flat felt seam here on the other shoulder, and I'm tucking it under, as you can see. And the reason, of course, is because this is finish the seam allowance. This is one way to get around finishing the edges of your seam allowances. And this is thin fabric, so it can be flat felt. With men's shirts, it's called single needle. This is a high-end finish in men's clothing. Talk about fussy. But I'm going to go back and I'm going to sew another seam that's straighter and that catches this, because I want this to look a certain way. Just run it into that seam. And that means rip a few more stitches out, but I want my garment to look a certain way. Besides, I'll be showing this stuff at the master class, and I want my garments to look good. So you can see that one of the ways to get them to look good is just to use your plain old stitch ripper. Okay, out it comes again. So now I've taken those stitches out, and you can see the seam looks a lot better. There's a little bit of a thread hanging right here. I'll just take my snips and get rid of that so that it doesn't show. Here's the binding that I sewed before, and I'm going to start at the left shoulder seam, and I have to make sure that I've got the wrong side up, which I do. And the first thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to lay a piece right here. I'm going to sew it around. Now I know I have enough on this to go around the neck and the armholes because I measured the pattern and I cut that amount that I needed. I didn't just cut at random. I'm going to finish this when I get to the end, so there will be a seam here, and I think I'll bring this back a little bit, and there's going to be a seam here that will meet right here. These seams are sewn at an angle. You would think they'd show more, but they don't. If you sew across this way when you're putting binding on, it shows right up. If you have it at an angle, somehow it fools the eye. And even though it's a longer line, the eye doesn't seem to see it. So that's why I have that at an angle. All right, and now I'm going to sew on 1/4 inch seam allowance. I'm going to sew slow to make sure it's edge to edge. I have a notch here which tells me that's the center back. And as I'm sewing up, I'm sewing against the grain. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to just shear it in a little bit. And that's done by putting your index finger in back. It just keeps it even. It doesn't allow the back to stretch out. The back is moving out. It has to be edge to edge. So I'm fighting to keep it edge to edge. And it's going around a bit of a circle, so what matters, it's going to buckle up on the edge here, but what matters is that it is flat where the sewing machine is sewing. You have to go slow as you go around these curves. Here I'm sewing with the grain, so there's no need to shear in. As I'm about to go over this dart, I need to make sure that the dart is edge to edge to the neckline. And I'm going to put a pin in there to hold it in place as I come down over it. I'm going to make sure I don't sew over the pin, of course. Make sure I don't sew anything other than what I want to sew. Be easy to sew through, for instance, a side seam or something if you're not careful, because there's a lot of fabric here. And you know whether or not you're sewing against the grain or with the grain because you see the little fray. The fray is going that direction. If it were going this direction toward me, I'd be sewing with the grain. But because the fray is going that direction, I'm sewing against the grain, which is why I need to shear in just a little bit as it goes around to maintain the neck edge. There's no reason to stay stitch the edge first before you sew the binding on. You don't have to do it as long as you shear in as you sew the binding. And here I've got another dart, and again it needs to fold back. I need to make sure that it's edge to edge. You will make sure it's exactly edge to edge so that it doesn't extend above or below that neckline. Okay, take the pin out. And now we're almost to the shoulder, as you can see. And we have, all right, so I've taken this out a ways because I don't want connection here and a connection here. That won't look so good. So I bring it back here, and then it'll be in the back, and it'll be over in the front here, back here, and over front here. And people won't really notice that. And you'd be surprised. You would think that these seams show right up, but they don't. And I shear in a little bit to take care of the little bit that it might ease out. Bring it right on across the shoulder. Get it out. Now the trick is to sew this together, because this has got to be like this. And this is what you do. I'm laying the one against the other, like this. See, this is going to be sewn across this way. See, this is at a 90-degree angle. You could say that we've squared it, because this forms a square and this forms a square here. And we're going to sew across this diagonal, and that's how you do it. Line it up so that it's exactly right. Just let it tack a little bit there so it holds. And I first want to check. And see that? It's going to flush even. And I'm going to wrap my binding around the seam allowance to cover it. I'm going to do that all around the neckline, but I'm just going to do a little bit here so you can see what happens. You see, it covers this, comes just to the stitching, because an 1 1/4 inch wide binding is covering a 1/4 inch seam allowance. So you need a quarter, up quarter, over quarter, under quarter, and remember, or at least I'm pointing out to you, folds have dimensions. This binding is 1 1/4 inch wide. The seam allowance here is 1/4 inch wide. So this binding needs a quarter, then a quarter to come up, a quarter to go over, and a quarter to go under. You would think it would be 1 inch. So why is it 1 1/4 inch? And the answer is because the fabric folds here. Then it folds here as it goes over. Then it folds down again, and it folds under and up. And each of these folds, right across the top of the fold, right across the top of the fold here, right at this fold here, is a fraction, just a little fraction, but it adds up to that additional 1/4 inch. So you need it to be 1 1/4 inch wide, because fabric is not two-dimensional, it is three-dimensional. We don't think of it as three-dimensional, but there's a thickness in the fabric, and wherever you have a fold, there's a little bit of fabric that has to go across that fold, and that's why it's 1 1/4. All right, so I'm pinning it in place. It all has to be pinned in place by hand. Now, you're not going to get anything like this in the stores unless you pay a lot of money. As soon as a design room personnel or a factory personnel picks up a hand needle, bingo, the price skyrockets. I'm going to do the very same thing through the armholes, but there's no reason to show you all that. I think you've got the idea. Okay, and now I can put the thread through the dart and back on. This fabric is very dense. It's thin, but it's dense, very densely woven. So that's how it goes. I'm going to sew all the way around after it's all pinned. Thank you for watching, and I hope that you are able to use the skills I'm showing you to make clothing that's nicer and better and that you truly enjoy wearing. Bye for now. I'll see you again soon.